In January 1918 broke out an influenza pandemic that lasted for almost 3 years until December 1920 and led to tens of millions of deaths worldwide, whether directly or indirectly. So in this video, based on the Wikipedia article around sorry, on that subject, I will try to explain why that happened. Of course, the fact that some 100 years ago, medicine, including vaccinations and hygiene, were and antibiotics yeah, the medical practices and science were clearly less developed than now. Probably nowadays such an epidemic would not cause such a huge toll of deaths, estimated at between 50 and 100 million, according to the English language Wikipedia article on this subject. So it was an unusually deadly influenza pandemic, usually called the Spanish flu. The first of the two pandemics involving the H1N1 influenza virus. The subtype of influenza A virus that was the most common cause of human influenza flu in 2009. Even people on remote Pacific islands, so in southeastern Asia and Oceania, and in the Arctic, so in the far north of North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, were infected with this virus. So some 50 to 100 million people, or 3 to 5% of the world's population at that time, succumbed to this disease. Infectious disease already limited life expectancy in the early 20th century, but in the first year of the pandemic, life expectancy in the United States dropped by about 12 years. And this was remarkable because the United States was spared from any direct attacks in the First World War, and it was almost spared by comparison from direct attacks, aside from basically the Pearl Harbor bombing in the Second World War. And not that many refugees had the logistical chances to flee to the United States during the war because of the submarine warfare practiced by the German Navy, eventually even against the ships and other vessels that were traveling under the neutral countries' flags. Most influenza outbreaks disproportionately kill juvenile, meaning babies, infants, young children, elderly, and already weakened patients. So, for example, those who have chronic, life-threatening, or at least life-weakening diseases such as diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease. Let alone then, for example, degenerative diseases of the muscles, or Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. In contrast, the 1918 pandemic predominantly killed previously healthy young adults. So according to scientists, there were several possible reasons for this outbreak. Possibly the virus's specific variant had an unusually aggressive nature. One group of researchers recovered the virus from the bodies of frozen victims and found that transfection in animals caused a rapidly progressive respiratory failure and death through a cytokine storm, or overreaction of the body's immune system. It was postulated that the strong immune reactions of young adults ravaged the body, whereas the weaker immune systems of children and middle-aged adults resulted in fewer deaths among those groups. More recent investigations, based mainly on original medical reports from the period of the pandemic, found that the viral infection itself was not more aggressive than any previous influenza, but that the special circumstances of the epidemic, malnourishment, overcrowded medical camps and hospitals, poor hygiene, promoted bacterial superinfection that killed most of the victims, typically after a somewhat prolonged deathbed. Historical and epidemiological data are inadequate to identify the pandemic's geographic origin. It was implicated in the outbreak of encephalitis lethargica in the 1920s. In order to prevent people from being overly scared or desperate, wartime censors minimized early reports of illness and mortality in Germany, Britain, France, and the United States. After all, the First World War was still going on until early November 1918. Newspapers were free to report the epidemic's effects in neutral Spain, such as the grave illness of King Alfonso XIII. These created a false impression of Spain as especially hard hit, thereby giving rise to the pandemic's nickname, Spanish flu. Some countries and areas were less affected. In Japan, some 257,000 people had died of this influenza epidemic by July 1919, or an estimated 0.425%, so less than 0.5% of the population. Much lower than nearly all other Asian countries for which data was calculated. The Japanese government severely restricted sea travel to and from the home islands when the pandemic struck. In the Pacific and Oceanian regions, American Samoa and the French colony of New Caledonia also succeeded in preventing even a single death from influenza through effective quarantines. In Australia, almost 12,000 people died. By the end of the pandemic, the isolated island of Marajó in Brazil's Amazon River Delta had not reported an outbreak. St. Helena, that remote island in the southern Atlantic Ocean, where the deposed autocratic French Emperor Napoleon I was exiled in 1815 until he died there in 1821, also reported no deaths. In a 2009 paper published in the journal Clinical Infectious Diseases, Karen Starko proposed that aspirin poisoning contributed substantially to the fatalities. She based this on the reported symptoms in those dying from the flu, as reported in the post-mortem reports still available, and also the timing of the big death spike in October 1918, so just weeks before fighting in the First World War officially ended. This occurred shortly after the Surgeon General of the United States Army and the Journal of the American Medical Association both recommended very large doses of 8 to 31 grams of aspirin per day as part of treatment. These levels will produce hyperventilation or excessive breathing in 33% of patients, as well as lung edema in 3% of patients. Starko also notes that many early deaths showed wet, sometimes hemorrhagic lungs, whereas late deaths showed bacterial pneumonia. She suggests that the wave of aspirin poisonings was due to a perfect storm of events. Bayer's patent on aspirin expired, so many companies rushed in to make a profit and greatly increased the supply. This coincided with the Spanish flu, and the symptoms of aspirin poisoning were not known at the time. As an explanation for the universally high mortality rate, this hypothesis was questioned in a letter to the journal published in April 2010 by Andrew Neumer and Daisy Carrion of the University of California, Irvine, and Niall Johnson of the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare. They questioned the universal applicability of the aspirin theory, given the high mortality rate in countries such as India, where there was little or no access to aspirin at the time compared to the rate where aspirin was plentiful. After the lethal second wave struck in late 1918, new cases dropped abruptly, almost to nothing after the peak in the second wave. Another theory holds that the 1918 virus mutated extremely rapidly to a less lethal strain. This is a common occurrence with influenza viruses. There is a tendency for pathogenic viruses to become less lethal with time, as the hosts of more dangerous strains tend to die out. See also deadly second wave above. Academic Andrew Price Smith has made the argument that the virus helped tip the balance of power in the later days of the war towards the Allied cause. On the other hand, given the fact that the United States had already in April 1917 significantly swelled the Allied or Entente ranks with its huge military and economic arsenals, the Entente powers would in any case have defeated the collapsing Central Powers, of which Germany was the only officially fighting country by the time the war ended by the armistice in early November 1918. The outbreak coincided with the deaths and media focus on the First World War, and another explanation involves the age group affected by the disease. The majority of fatalities were among young adults. The duration of the pandemic and the war could also have played a role. The disease would usually only affect a certain area for a month before leaving, while the war, which most had initially expected to end quickly, had lasted for 4 years by the time the pandemic struck, or 3.5 years anyway.